Group, Mr. Faisal Arif, Chief Strategy Officer of Sunway Group, Mr. Daniel Rahman, CEO of ASLI, Dr. Shahridan Faiz, Chairman of Citizens International, member of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome again to Confronting Global Economic Shocks, Lessons and Challenges for the Global South. Pergi berhuma di Tanjung Rokan sebelum pulang mengail ikan. Kehadiran tuan-puan kami alu-alukan, kecil telapak tangan niru kami tadahkan. My name is Anas from the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute, and it's my pleasure to be your host this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, for your information, the program today is a collaboration between ASLI, Sunway University and Citizens International. We are at a moment of genuine uncertainty, trade disruptions, shifting geopolitical alignments, restructuring of RON 95 quota, and the Global South is navigating all of it without the same buffers the developed world can draw on. This forum is our attempt to be honest about that. To explain the flow of today's event, we will begin by the welcoming remarks delivered by Professor Dato' Elizabeth Liew, followed by the forum and the Q&A session. Sudilah Tuan jalan berlapan di malam kelam. Sudilah Datuk beri ucapan kata aluan pemanis kalam. Next, we would like to invite Professor Dato' Elizabeth Liew, Group CEO of Sunway Education and Director of the ASLI Board of Directors to deliver her welcoming remarks. Please welcome.
Terima kasih, Tuan Anas. I cannot do the pantun. Thank you very much. It is such a pleasure to see so many of you here today. Thank you for gracing the occasion. Ambassadors who are with us in our midst, His Excellency Gerhard Eisel, Ambassador of Austria, together with Her Excellency Christina Berner from Denmark. And our man of the hour has asked us, or rather has asked me to actually start the proceedings this morning, even before one of our speakers are here. And we have a wonderful panel of speakers this morning. And here they are together with us. We have Ms. Shakira, we have Mr. Shahril, Hamdan, and then we have Dr. Shah as well. And YB Liew Tong is on his way. So we're very excited about that. So, like I said, it's such a pleasure to welcome all of you here, and I mean that this sincerely, not just as a formality. Welcome to Sunway City, as you can see, right next to you, and welcome to Sunway University. For those of you who are joining us here for the first time, I always love this moment because this place has a story worth telling. Because everything that you see around here today, which is the university, you probably passed the hospital, the city and the people, none of this was here, say, 40 years ago. The time is getting longer and longer. I would have said 30 years ago, but then again, I have been here. This is my 34th year, so it cannot be. So I would say 40 years ago. Definitely in the 80s, this land was a disused tin mining wasteland. Very much abandoned and barren and considered by most to have little future. So our chairman, Tan Sri Sir Geoffrey Chia, saw it differently. He saw possibility where others saw ruins, and through sheer persistence, he transformed this piece by piece into what is now regarded as one of Asia's model integrated townships. I know this very well because definitely coming here 34 years ago, it was very much just Sunway College. Not even this building, this is a new addition, but the original Sunway College building where you were probably stopped. And then there was right at the bottom of the lagoon, where you can see it now, the theme park. These were the only two. And only the college was visible because the lagoon was down under, so as to say. So now, on the education side, which is, as many of you will know, is where my heart lives. And the Sunway Education Group has been on this journey of growth and purpose. Since 1987, we have grown from being the single institution that I mentioned into a family of more than 20, spanning international schools in Kuala Lumpur and Johor, colleges across the whole peninsula, all the way through to our flagship here, which is Sunway University. And today, we are home to more than 30,000 students from over 100 countries around the world. I must check whether we have, how many we have from Austria and also from Denmark, because if we don't, then I'll have to come and speak more with our ambassadors. So that diversity is intentional because we've always believed that education is at its best, not simply about what happens inside the classroom. It's about preparing young people to go out into a world that is complex, sometimes unkind, and still be able to lead with knowledge, with empathy, and with purpose. And that belief, honestly, is what makes this morning's event feel so important to me. The world right now is asking very hard questions. Energy markets, oh my God, they are volatile. Supply chains remain fragile, to say the best. Inflation, it has squeezed governments, households alike, and developing economies, our economies, are navigating this with fewer buffers and less margin for error than their wealthier counterparts. Now, these are not distant concerns. They really affect the students in our classrooms, the families in our communities, and the nations that all of us in this room have a stake in. So, which is why I want to take a moment to acknowledge the role of government, and in particular, the efforts being made here in Malaysia. Our policymakers have not been passive in the face of these shocks. There has been real, substantive effort to stabilise, to protect, and to plan, and that deserves recognition. We are very glad to have with us today YB Liew Tong, who will be coming in a bit. He is Deputy Minister of Finance, whose presence actually signals that this is not simply an academic exercise. Of course, we all know he got into a bit of trouble yesterday, but you can quiz him about it afterwards. So this is a policy conversation, ladies and gentlemen, grounded in real stakes, with real decision makers at the table. So definitely, we are very honored to have you here with us today. As I have acknowledged, our panelists, Shakira, Shahril, and of course, Dr. Shah, they're all Shah in a way, you know. And, but they are not shy at all, we hope not, who have this real gift for translating complex economic realities into conversations that the public can actually connect with and care about. So this is, in my view, one of the most underrated skills in the policy world. And moderating our session today is, like I said, Dr. Sharifuddin Faiz from the Citizens International, an organization that has long championed spaces exactly like this one, where civil society and government can think together openly and honestly. So I also want to say a special word about ASLI, the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute. Of course, you all know Daniel Rahman very well, and he is our face of ASLI. He is our soul of ASLI right now. And as a member of ASLI's board of directors, it actually gives me particular pride to see this collaboration come to life today. ASLI has for many years been a trusted platform for rigorous and timely policy discourse. And the partnership between Sunway and ASLI reflects a shared conviction that serious ideas need serious places to breathe, and that a think tank and a university together have a natural responsibility to provide just that. So in closing, I want to say one more thing before I hand the morning over to those far more qualified than me to speak on global economics. Now, there is this temptation that in times of crisis to turn inward, to protect what is ours, to pull up the drawbridge, so as to say, and to treat complexity as a reason for paralysis. I understand that instinct, but I do not think it is the right one. And I say this as an educator who has spent 3 decades watching what happens when people choose learning over fear. So the Global South does not need to be a passive recipient of global economic forces. We have lessons of our own. We have navigated crisis before. The Asian financial crisis, the dot-com collapse, the global financial crisis, a pandemic not so long ago. And through each of them, what has made the difference is not just policy cleverness. It has been solidarity. The willingness to share knowledge, to build regional trust, and to refuse the idea that developing nations must simply absorb shocks that more than often not they did not create. So yes, these are difficult times, but they are also, I think, revealing times. They reveal what we are made of. They reveal the depth of our institutions, the quality of our leadership, and whether we are willing to support one another, not just within borders, but across them. That spirit, I hope, is what fills this room today. So I look forward to a rich, honest, and genuinely useful conversation, and I hope that each of you leaves this morning with something more than you came in with. Once again, a very warm welcome to Sunway University, and to our guests near and far, terima kasih.
Thank you so much, Professor Dato' Elizabeth Lee, for the welcoming remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin the forum, we are going to do something a little bit different. My boss attended an event in the past, and when he came back, he came back with a feedback. He mentioned that in a forum or an event like this, you've got a room full of smart, expert, informed, and curious people, but nobody asked them anything. So, before we begin, we would like to request everyone in the hall today to scan the QR code now to answer a few questions that we will be answering together. So you can go to slido.com or scan the QR code and put in the number 3284796. Has everybody joined? All okay? Yes, okay. So you will not be able to see anything yet. So if everybody is in, yeah. So we will be putting up the first question now. With global economic uncertainty hitting home, what worries you most right now? Petrol and fuel prices going up again, food and grocery prices getting harder to manage, my job and income feeling less secure, whether my children will have a better opportunities than I did. Okay, we have 20 people. You can still join and scan the QR code. Everybody has answered. So I think the most interesting answer would be food and grocery prices getting harder to manage. Okay, our panelists can take note. We will go to the next question. As oil prices spike due to the West Asia conflict, what should Malaysia do? Expand targeted subsidies to protect the B40, double down on local food and energy production, accelerate the shift to renewables so we are less exposed, let prices adjust and focus it on the most vulnerable, restructure the quota of RON 95. No, that's not the answer. Okay, we have 40 people already answered the question. 50, 20 more? Okay, we can see what is the most popular answer. Accelerate the shift to renewables so we are less exposed. Okay, okay. Next question. The West Asia conflict is hitting developing nations the hardest. What's the core reason global South countries keep absorbing the worst of this crisis? We are too dependent on global power, our currencies crumble, we lack the industrial base, weak institutions slow down our crisis response every time. What do you think? What would be your answer? So the room thinks we are too dependent on global powers for trade, finance and energy. Okay. Next question. Compared to the current West Asia conflict, which crisis has had a greater impact on your life? COVID-19 or the current crisis? This is the second last question. COVID-19 had a much greater impact on my daily life. Maybe for now, so I do not know. Okay. 70 people has answered. Okay, last question. For everybody, despite everything, what about Malaysia today gives you hope for the future? Our political stability, the way we come together as a nation, honestly, the food will be fine. Strong economic fundamentals that can weather the storm. I'm sure there will be one popular answer. Okay, easy win for the food. A round of applause for everybody. Thank you so much for answering our short survey. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the feedback. Our panel today will be moderated by Dr. Shahridan Faiz, or Dr. Shah as many knows him. Dr. Shah is a development practitioner with experience spanning Eastern Europe, Central Asia and West Africa. Formerly based in Washington, D.C. with the World Bank and now with Think City. His work focuses on resilience, working closely with both national governments and local communities to address complex social and economic challenges. Dr. Shah obtained his PhD from the University of Cambridge and is currently the chairman of Citizens International, a civil society organization dedicated to advancing solidarity among nations of the Global South. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shahridan Faiz to the stage.
Thank you very much, Anas. A very good morning and Assalamualaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Dato', for a wonderful welcoming address. I'd like to also thank Daniel for helping organize this wonderful event. I also like to continue a very important point that Dato' mentioned earlier about the transformation that has happened to this physical space. It's important to remember the amazing transformation that's happened. What was once an abandoned mining pool has now become this thriving city that's also become an education hub, training the future generations of leaders for our planet. And that actually is a reflection of Malaysia's own amazing development transformation. Transforming from a country that was largely agrarian in the 1950s to becoming, a nation that's on the cusp of becoming a high-income country. Yeah? And this cannot happen without, again, what Dato' alluded to earlier, the important partnership between the private sector, public sector, and also civil society. And so, I'm very happy to be here today, sitting on this platform, to be able to talk to you about an important issue that's impacting not only our country, but also the planet. Now, to frame this, I think there are two important things to bear in mind. I think one is the fact that we live in an increasingly interdependent and interconnected world. Something that happens in West Asia has a direct impact, on the price of petrol in Thailand, for example. When global shipping lines are disrupted in the Strait of Hormuz, food prices in Cairo goes up, the price of electricity in Nairobi gets impacted. And decisions that are made in Washington have far-reaching impacts on the youth in Global South, whether in terms of getting jobs or in terms of creating frustrations that then fuel radicalization. So we do live today in a highly interdependent, highly interconnected world. But we also know that this interconnected world is not an equal one. And I think that's important to bear in mind as we think about the crisis that we are facing today. I think the other important point to bear in mind also is that in our lifetime, we are actually experiencing something highly unusual, which is that we are facing crises of a global nature more frequently. Some of you may remember the 1998 financial crisis. Of course, we had the 2008 financial crisis. More recently, we had the COVID pandemic. And now we are dealing with the issue that we face today. So, what is clear to us is that the world has also changed dramatically. The world today is more volatile. And so the question arises, are our institutions equipped to deal with this new type of world? Are we ready as a society to deal with increasing volatility? So, I'm very happy today, ladies and gentlemen, because we have with us actually three very distinguished panelists. They are actually public intellectuals in their own right. And they are here to help us navigate these issues. And our hope is that we are able to provide clarity to you in terms of understanding the problems that we face today, but also to give you hope and positive ideas about how we need to organize ourselves better to withstand the challenges that we face. So without much further ado, I'd like to invite our two panelists to the stage. Ms. Shakira Sharifuddin. Let me give you a brief. They're all very distinguished and they all gave me very long CVs, but I'm going to summarize it. So Shakira, sorry, can you sit nearer because the minister might sit there. He's coming late. Yeah, please. Yeah. So Shakira, some of you may have seen her opinion pieces in the newspaper. She's a senior economist with the World Bank Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Finance Hub based in Kuala Lumpur. She leads the publication of the World Bank's Malaysia Economic Monitor and does a lot of work on policies focused on education, women and children. She's currently what I would consider be doing the right thing, which is she's pursuing a PhD away from economics. She's planning to be a sociologist. And she's also a proud mother of two autistic twin boys. So a big welcome to Shakira. Our second panelist, well, I guess needs no introduction. If all of you own a smartphone, you would already have known Shahril Hamdan by now. He is a prominent media voice in Malaysia as the co-host of the popular current affairs podcast Keluar, Sekejap, taking on important and often spicy topics related to politics, social contestations, and governance. Shahril previously served as the economic director in the Prime Minister's office, and he is also currently the head of Southeast Asia at Bullhound Capital, a global technology growth investor. Yeah. Well, our third panelist, YB Liew Tong, will be joining us a bit later, but maybe I'll give a brief introduction to him. Most of you would know he's a member of parliament for Iskandar Puteri. He's also currently our Deputy Minister of Finance. YB Liew is one of the country's leading strategic thinkers on economic transformation and industrial policy. His most recent book, Second Take-Off: Strategies for Malaysia's Economic Resurgence, is highly recommended as a compelling vision of how to turn Malaysia from a middle-income economy to a middle-class society. So I highly recommend that book for those of you who haven't read it yet. YB Tong played a key role in shaping the new Industrial Master Plan 2030, helping chart Malaysia's long-term direction in areas such as semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, and economic competitiveness. So we expect YB Tong to join us in about half an hour's time. Yeah. So the way we'll do it is, I told our panelists it's a bit of a jazz session. I think the framing has been well set by Dato' Elizabeth. The topic is also a topic of great interest. I think the first question I want to ask our panelists, and maybe we can start with Shakira. How can we think about this threat? Everyone's concerned and anxious about this looming threat. Right? How can we frame this? How can we think about this? Shakira.
Okay, thank you, Shah. Well, first of all, Assalamualaikum and Selamat Sejahtera. Thank you very much once again to ASLI and to Citizens International and also to Sunway University for having me here today. It's a pleasure. It's my second time here in the campus, and I think there's been a lot of changes since the last time I was here prior to COVID, I think 5-6 years ago. So it's been really nice, and thank you again for having me. I must say that when Shah sort of approached me to do this, I was a little bit apprehensive because the topic, or at least the initial framing of the topic, was on the current Middle Eastern conflict or Middle Eastern crisis. And I sort of said to Shah and told myself, here we go again with every time we have a crisis, regardless of what its name, the nature of it, there will be a whole host of events, panel discussions, talks, lectures, what have you not, around that particular topic. And sometimes I think we get a little bit fatigued talking about it from time to time. So I thought, well, I sort of, talked to Shah, and I thought maybe we can sort of take a step back and frame it in slightly differently, because I have two other panelists who will definitely be in a bit better position than I am to speak on the current crisis, but I will talk a little bit on that as well. And since we're talking about economic shocks or economic crisis per se, I think I was sort of writing down my notes and thinking about, when was the series of crises and the series of shocks that we've been experiencing all these years. And I think you have to go all the way back to 97, 98, during the Asian financial crisis, and that was probably the one crisis where it was internally triggered, where it was caused and triggered by our own set of vulnerabilities. There were current account deficits, we had high level of external debt, but following from that, and I think credits to the policy makers, as what Prof said earlier, we learn our lessons from that crisis, and that's how we sort of built buffers around the economy. And the successive crisis after that, so you have 2000, the sort of minor Y2K, and then the avian flu, and then the global financial crisis came, and then we have COVID and whatnot. We have the petroleum prices crash back in 2014, 15. Every other series of crises that came in we were somewhat buffeted. Not to say we weren't affected, but we were not in a very vulnerable position, or as vulnerable as we were back in 97, 98. And I think partly is because we've built our fundamentals and we've learned the lessons from 97, 98. I do think, however, there are certain things, Shah told me to make it as relevant to the younger generation here. What I have noticed is that crises since then have become more frequent and a lot more shorter. So it's sort of like keeping up with the time. So now these days we consume a lot of this TikTok brain rot culture where you keep on scrolling and consuming and to feed your sort of dopamine rush. But unlike that, the crises have sort of become more frequent and more rapid. And what my concern is, as we experience this crisis from one to the other, we've probably at some point lost sight of the bigger picture of the longer term challenges as we try to address the impact of the crisis. And it's rightfully so that if we take a look at the last few crises, there are recurring themes on what the challenges are and what the policy responses are or were. So in terms of the policy responses by the government, it has always been rightfully so, about stabilizing the economy, and that's where you have your policies surrounding generating spending or boosting consumption, and you have policies surrounding social protection. Those are very, very important policies, and certainly is needed during times of crisis. But the challenges also remain the same. We have always been constrained for the last 3, 4, 5 crises by our fiscal position, which limits the kind of responses that we are able to generate and able to introduce. There are also issues surrounding social protection in terms of adequacy and depth. So those are the short-term challenges. And I think if going back to Shah's question, what are the pressing challenges? I think if we look in terms of what are the immediate challenges, I would name those two. And I would probably stop here before we go on a longer term and bigger picture topics and issues. But I think I would leave you with that at the moment. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Shakira. So it's interesting you've raised the problem of constraints from a fiscal position, issues related to social protection. But maybe we can move a bit to Shahril, picking up from the work he's done in his podcast. On the political landscape side, these pressures that are coming, these threats that are looming, how do you see that impacting upon the political landscape of the country?
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Assalamualaikum and good morning. Thank you to Dato and everyone involved in organizing this event. Pleasure to be here. I am a frequent visitor of Sunway, especially the lagoon. I think I come here more often as an adult. I've been here more often as an adult than I have as a child, because I have a daughter to entertain. And even the experience in the lagoon, I think, has evolved to be much better than when I was a kid coming here when it first opened. So congratulations to Sunway as a group. So the topic was about global economic crises, but I think you're right, Dr. Shah, to broaden the conversation a bit more to be about crisis in general. So I want to do two things in this first set of remarks. One is to kind of build off what Shakira mentioned about what we've done after the 97-98 crisis as a symptom of how I reflect on how countries react to certain trauma. And the 97-98 crisis, as I understand it, and obviously I was still a child, but more as an adult reflecting on it and learning about it, it was a traumatic event for the entire economy and for the country. And so what do we learn from it? And in some ways we're living through the same learnings, or a lot of the things that are in place are because of that trauma. I think capital controls, we have a light version of it until today, and I would argue is a learned behavior from that trauma. We are allergic to the idea of borrowing in foreign currency. So I can't remember, Shakira, I think what 97-98% of our sovereign debt now is in ringgit. So we created the bond market, and not just sovereign debt, right? As I understood it, the 97-98 crisis was also precipitated by the fact that corporate borrowing, a lot of it was unhedged foreign currency borrowing. So that doesn't really happen anymore because we have a thriving debt market in our own currency. All of which I think are sound economic calls or policies. But use that frame about, one more. Remember when we were kids in the 90s, there was a big blackout. And then Tun Mahathir, Datuk Sri Mahathir, Dr. Mahathir at the time started IPPs and all the rest. So again, another example of how you need a traumatic event. My concern now is you put that frame to today's list of risks of crisis. I'm not sure that we are thinking ahead and imagining what the trauma will be like if any one of these actual crises to be happens. So let me list down a couple that I think everyone would intuitively agree on. One is the sense of the breakdown in international order. Everyone talks about this. The global international order is broken down. We don't know what's coming up in place. The collapse of the American empire and nothing to take that old hegemon's place. I'm not sure we've thought through about what exactly that means for us, and therefore what kind of buffers should we proactively put in place. So the concern here is that you need a trauma before you then start thinking. When actually if you think about it, and you put a policymaker's hat on it, you can foresee, you can game this out. You can, for example, because of the breakdown of global international order, or rules-based international order, imagine a situation where you have, the Deputy Minister is already here. You can imagine a scenario where we need to increase our defense capabilities as a country. And we need to think really strategically and carefully about asymmetric defense. Now, the talk of the town now is about drones, because that's what's happening in the frontier of Ukraine and Russia. Not sure in our policy-making circles how much people are talking about that, for example. Then you look at non-hardware ways of dealing with security concerns. And is there a way we leverage very strategically our, not choke point dominance, I don't think we have anything of that, but can we develop certain leverage that then is used in a defensive capability if and when something happens? So we have semiconductor, but I think we probably need more. Leads me to my third sort of risk to think about in terms of threats, artificial intelligence. Quite clear that the dialogue now is around, are there going to be massive job losses? And the ones who are talking about it are the tech bros, or people like me who try to be tech bros, or invest in them. But I also like to see actual policy class think carefully about what is the social bargain here that we want to put to the Malaysian public. We should think, for example, when robotics hits, not if, but when it does, when China produces really cheap robots, that even low-wage jobs get displaced, or there's a pressure for it to be displaced, what is the political economy decision that this country is likely to make? And there should be a debate, right? This party should say this, that party should say that. None of this debate is apparent to me. Maybe behind the scenes, but if I'm honest, I used to be part of the establishment. I have very low confidence that that is a set of conversations that are happening. They are worried about when elections going to happen. They're worried about, what coalition, this and that, the other, fine. But I think what I'd really like to see is at least a civil service or some part of the policy class, some politicians like the gentleman that's going to sit next to us today, not just because he's here, but I think he is one of the very few that actually, attempts to make policy and intellectual conversations about these topics. There needs to be lots more of that, right? So if you think about it very crudely, are we going to say, have a plan that job displacements will not be allowed to happen at a pace or a rapid pace beyond X? Now, what is X? We will not allow unemployment to happen faster than Y. So that's a first order principle question. Again, that's a big threat that's looming. Don't think our policy and political class is currently thinking about it carefully or as carefully as they should be. And then very briefly, I think, don't want to take too much time, but other threats around polarization, around populism, that's more political. again, are we ready? Are we thinking of how to reimagine politics in a way where, whether you want to call it center ground, whether you want to talk about progressive politics or system-based politics, that isn't about burning the house down, it isn't about appealing to ethnocentric extremes, that isn't about that kind of sharp nationalism that isn't going to actually solve problems but really can excite the public in ways that can drive voter behavior but not solve problems. Again, not sure that within our entire society, whether it's think tanks to government to serious policymakers to fair-minded politicians who, yes, want to win votes but in their heart of hearts also doesn't want to see this country get burned down, do they realize that their rhetoric on their narratives right now cannot compete with the appeal of populist reactionary rhetoric that often exists in the same political party that they are in? So yeah, I know you wanted me to be hopeful and optimistic, but I just thought laying down just a handful of these risks and challenging all of us to figure out a way where we can come together in a serious and considered manner and think about the actual problems at hand. And these actual problems are not about what's happening in Negeri Sembilan. It's not who's going to be the next government necessarily. The concern is like whoever becomes the next government, do we actually have the political policy and civil society set of configurations to meet the moment? And I worry we don't.
Wow, very nice comments there by Shahril, because I think what he's basically said is that, you know, he's asking a question, are we too fixated on firefighting, right, to put a fire out in the house when we're not paying enough attention to what's happening to the neighborhood, you know, and that has got a more significant, more far-reaching impact on what's going to happen to us in the near future. Now, we are very lucky because our honored guest, YB Liew Tong, has managed to join us. So I've already given a brief introduction of you, YB Liew. So maybe we'll just jump straight into the question that was raised. You know, I think, in a sense, you know, as someone who is sitting in the hot seat, and we know things were very hot yesterday. What are the kind of policy trade-offs that you have to grapple with in having to deal on the one hand with this issue of the fire that's happening in the house, but also being mindful that the neighborhood itself is under threat?
We are entering. Thank you, Hamdan, Sharifuddin, and everyone. Very good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I must apologize because I was dragged on at another event. We are living in probably once in 80-year shift. We are seeing the most important and most consequential shift in global order since the end of the Second World War. And each of what is happening around the world has consequences on us in Malaysia as well as on the region. And we need to be able to see what we are dealing with in a broader context. And if we are able to navigate, Malaysia is a very interesting nation. Malaysia is interesting because for instance, in this current crisis, Malaysia is distinctively different from its neighbor, partly because it has oil, it has palm oil, it has a manufacturing base, it has the logistical centrality in the region, and it is recognized. But how much more we can push in order to get the best out of our economy, that really required all of us to think through. On Monday, I was with the Deputy Meeting Minister, Sim Zizin, and we were doing something very interesting to me. I'm not sure whether it will interest you, but we were bringing together
the user of plastic, Coca-Cola, Dutch Lady, what they call, and other big companies. And we brought them to meet with the recycling operators in the country. What is interesting is that most of Malaysians' use of plastic have been importing plastic from China, semi-finished goods. And we do have a very sophisticated recycling industry that import waste from other countries and recycle here and export to Europe at very high grade, food grade and beyond. But these two industries have never met or have never sat down to think of domestic circularity. So I'm trying to impress upon you what we have that we have not actually thought through. We have not actually linked the silos within our society, but we are lucky because all this exists in the same environment. Now, whether we have the political will, whether the community, the policy community, as well as the academics, the journalists, everyone, whether we can come together to recognize that the world is shifting in a major way. We are in a crisis, although many of us don't feel it. But at the same time, we have very interesting tools and supply chain, as well as companies and relationship domestically and with other countries that we can tap on so that we could see a leapfrog of what Malaysia is now. I think we have that opportunity. How far can we push? How far can we reach? I'm not sure.
Thank you, YB. So clearly, talking about the changes that have happened and the looming threats, what has significantly shifted is that the way we think about economic growth has also got to shift. We now have to start thinking about resilience much more seriously. You know, and I'm interested to hear from our panelists. What does resilience mean to you? You know, maybe we can start with Minister Tong, as a person sitting in the Ministry of Finance.
Oh, we have been so used to the idea of the pursuit of efficiency. And we have been thinking of everything from the perspective of efficiency. We have been asking ourselves whether we are competitive. And the question of competition comes to mind every day. For about 20 years, from 2001, when China joined WTO, to COVID-19 in 2020, this part of the world has been dominated by this one single question. Can we produce whatever cheaper? And it has to be cheaper than China. So we have been in this competition of race to the bottom in terms of price, in terms of government providing incentive to companies in order to exploit the workers and in order to exploit the environment, to produce very cheap products. And it is a difficult task because China was cheaper for the longest of time during that 20 years. But the pursuit of efficiency is now coming to an end. We are no longer in a just-in-time world. We are in a just-in-case world. The world has shifted from just-in-time to just-in-case. We should now move away from thinking of producing cheaper goods. We must now price in resilience at every juncture. Maybe costlier, maybe less efficient, quote unquote, but more resilient. And resilient is what we should be pursuing. Now, when we start thinking about resilience, Malaysia is interesting. As I say, when Coca-Cola or Dutch Lady is thinking about the resilience of their plastic supply chain, then the local plastic recyclers do not necessarily have to think of just selling to Europe or the US. They can think of local or domestic circularity. They can think of selling locally, because then it's a question of whether Coca-Cola, Dutch Lady, and some of these companies are prepared to offtake, pay more, or provide more secure contracts. And here is where we as government and the policy community can come in to build back better, to reshape the supply chain, and to create a different conversation about price. Once we look at this differently, I think Malaysia is uniquely positioned.
Thank you. Maybe Shahril, you'd like to also comment about your thoughts on resilience.
I think the Deputy Minister is quite right in terms of just in case versus the old just in time. What would be interesting is to consider whether there is the appetite to make that big mindset shift. Because I think the mindset shift is not simply saying it's just in, no more just in time, it's just in case. It also means difficult considerations around, do we chase FDI the same way we chase FDI in the past? I think we've been FDI pilled for a long time. Is it possible that we may need to reduce our obsession on GDP growth numbers in exchange for resilience? Because it means maybe exporting less, in a very basic theoretical sense. It may mean investing in less fast-growing capabilities or sectors. And then thirdly, and this might be the most difficult thing, understanding how the political class works, a desire and willingness to focus on 3 to 5 things only. I think that's something I said yesterday at a different forum. As politicians, I think many of times they need to feel like they've covered all bases, when really the right answer is to be laser focused on what are the 3 to 5 areas that you think disproportionately affect the equation of resilience. So potentially, I'm not saying these are the 3 or 5, but potentially you are laser focused on the fact that food security is a key dimension of resilience. So that means what? That means fiscal spending goes there, that means talent goes there, that means actual policy, your best policy brains go there. Maybe the second area is around healthcare. I think that's like, you can see it, the threat down the track already, right? You know what's coming, it's already happening, and you know if you don't do something to healthcare financing and all this bunch of questions around healthcare, confirm in 20 years, your kids will, curse at this generation, why didn't you do the tough things? Or why, for example, do you have the guts to consider doing national health insurance, right? It's going to be unpopular, but can you make the case? Do you have the political wherewithal to then tell the public, I'm going to take some from your gaji, but this is for the good of the country and resilience, right? But that means you spend your political capital on that, not on other things. Maybe a third area, I don't know, maybe it could be, maybe energy security. So just having that sense and clarity and have the entire society and government talk and sing from the same sheet, I think that's the third challenge and arguably the hardest, because that means you talk less about nelayan. That means you talk less about, I don't know, some other industry where you have potentially 5,000 votes in some constituency. You got to be willing to make that bargain and make that case and think beyond the next election cycle. So I would say those are the challenge, right? From translating this just in time to just in case to the next order of decision making and approach to life. And that transition is often more difficult because of politics.
And maybe we can hear from Shakira, from a social protection perspective, how do you see resilience playing in this?
Right. So I sort of wanted to, I guess, write on Sharil's last point about, the point on resilience, essentially. I think in our earlier rounds of discussion, we talk more about the short term, the addressing, the putting out fires type of exercise. And then I think one of the things that is challenging to policymakers and policy and space in general for this country is that sometimes, or more often than not, we are unable to learn the lessons from the crisis. I think we did a very good job back in 97, 98. But I think because the frequency of crisis that is taking place in the country is becoming more and more rapid, that we don't have time, number one, to sit and reflect on what are some of the key lessons that we learned from the current crisis. But I think more importantly, and this is where the resilient points comes in, is that we sometimes forget or didn't have time to pay attention on some of the challenges, the fundamental challenges that are affecting this country, not necessarily on the economics per se, but on other things. And these are the things that will matter going forward in the future. So take, for example, if you really want to tie this back to social related issues, on stunting. So we have a high degree of stunting in this country, 20%. That's very high for a country at this level of development. And that has an implication on your workforce going forward, on your future children going forward. And yet, because we've been spending so much time, giving so much of our energy to put out fires, if you will, that we somehow put this at the back burner, and then we hope that there will come a time where we might have the time to pay attention on this matter, when it will compound, when on the contrary, it will compound going forward. So that's one. Another big social challenges I think that we sometimes put on side is our population itself. We are growing older. So we are an aging population. So how does that play then into the space, into how we are going to face the next economic crisis, which is probably going to happen within the next few years or so. It's no longer 5 years, it's probably the next couple of years. That is another challenge, and that will have constraint, will have demand on your fiscal needs and fiscal challenges, on your healthcare sector. And we've not, I guess, from where I sit, we've not had a proper discussion on addressing some of the more structural and fundamental challenges. There was a time, I think some of you might remember, there was a politician who came out with a statement, Melayu mudah lupa. Some of you might remember who that person is. But I think as much as I would laugh at that statement, sometimes I think it's a reflection on us as well. We forget, or we sort of put aside those structural issues. And I think one big example I would have, and it relates to the current crisis. During COVID-19, it was such a sudden crisis, such an abrupt crisis, that we came to a halt and most of us end up working at home, flexible working. Now, 5-6 years down the road, I can't believe we still have that conversation within the policy space on whether or not we should implement, how we should implement, when we already have that experience beforehand. And I think we discuss it from a very narrow lens of economic perspective, when there are so many other dimensions that we can bring into the picture. So I think in terms of building resilience, I think there is a need to open up our perspective beyond just stabilizing the economy, because I think that's usually what the priority is, but building fundamentals going forward.
Good. Well, in policy circles, there's a saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I have a question for YB Liew. If you had the leeway, what would be the priority reform that you would pursue in the context of the crisis we have today?
I think the current crisis that we have, number one, we are entering into this crisis in a position of strength. But at the same time, we also now know very well that this crisis, at least the energy crunch, is going to last much longer than we first anticipated. For energy supply to recover is pre-28th of February, level. It may take 6, 9 or 12 months. For price to recover, maybe 12, 18 or 24 months. So we know that we are dealing with not just a short-term shock, but it will drag on, and we need to be prepared for the long haul. Thirdly, we must come with this attitude that we want to build back better. Using a term that we learned from COVID, there are multiple areas that we should look at. We should look at our travel patterns. We should look at how to create more housing stocks in inner city, so that young people do not necessarily have to stay in Kajang, Seremban, Shah Alam, or wherever, to consider themselves being part of KL. We will have to look at how to pump in a lot more resources for public transport, But also on the technological front, I think it is time for us to see our technological capability that we have and build upon them so that we become a formidable and indispensable middle in the supply chain. Beyond that, Shakira mentioned about the social aspect. It is also time for us to look at how to ensure that we deal with the twin challenge. What is the twin challenge that when it comes to our society in the long run? I would say that number one, how do we prevent Gen Z protests? Gen Z protests is about jobs, it's about wages, it's about upward social mobility. How do we ensure that these questions are dealt with? Secondly, how do we ensure that Malaysia get rich before we grow old? As you say, it will come soon. And we cannot rely on just distribution. We must grow as well. We need better distribution of resources, wealth, and income. But at the same time, we also need to generate growth. How to generate growth? I think we must have a mindset shift. We have been seeing ourselves as a trading nation. So back to what Shahril said earlier, we see ourselves as trading anything that is available, including trading foreign workers, or human trafficking. But what we should really do is really to move beyond the mindset of a trading nation, to see ourselves as a technology nation. Malaysia has technological capability. This capability has mostly been used to support FDI over the years. But we do have very significant capability, for example, in the industries that support the semiconductor industries. It is time for them to proliferate horizontally. Say, for example, the equipment and automation capability in the semiconductor industry. It's time for them to proliferate into medical devices, into agriculture technology, into maybe even defense industry. That is actually within reach if we have clear policy consensus within the society. It is actually possible for what we have to proliferate horizontally. But of course, we also want to do more in the semiconductor verticals, given that semiconductor grows so rapidly now. There are so many potentials and opportunities there, and we think that that is also an area that we need to grow. So broadly, I am hopeful for this country in the long haul because of the endowment we have. Of course, how to create that political consensus across parties, across communities and ethnicities, and across the South China Sea. I think that is very crucial. Societies evolve and change, and sometimes society take a leapfrog. The best comparable scenario that we have now, I think, is not the 90s, not the 80s, but to go back to the 1970s. The 1970s, there was a rupture in 1969, and followed by a rupture. There was a new prime minister. There was this whole idea of rebalancing from a pro-Western geopolitical stance to a more neutral geopolitical stance, domestically changing of coalition patterns and ruling coalitions, ruling government, and also the shift away from import substitution industrialization to export-oriented industrialization, and the massive, what they call injections of new foreign FDI into the community. So we are probably in comparable times in the magnitude of change that we have to undergo. I think the 70s is a good reference point. Now, before I end this part, why the 70s is also relevant, I would say that in the 1973-1974 energy crisis, we actually built back better. We built something called Petronas. The Petronas bill, PDA, the Petroleum Development bill or act was passed in Parliament a day before the Parliament was dissolved in 1974. During that crisis, the then government realized that we need a national oil corps. We need to have more control over petroleum within our shoreline. And Petronas was created. In this crisis now, we have to thank those people who created Petronas. I visited Labuan a month ago, and they took me to see the methanol facilities that Petronas has in Labuan. The two factories combined is the largest facility of methanol in the world. It is amazing because of the decisions that we made, because at that point of time, leaders thought that they have to build something better in order to build, they have to build resilience to deal with future challenges. We built Petronas, and we have it now, and that contributed to the resilience that we have now. This crisis, we should think in that sort of mindset, that we need to build something in order to deal with the current challenges, but also build institutions that will last the decades to come, so that Malaysia will emerge as a much stronger nation.
Thank you. So that's very interesting and a very compelling vision about how we need to move, what was it, to become rich before we become old, right? So I'm going to ask our two panelists here to maybe respond to that compelling vision with a simple question. I guess, number one, how attainable is that? And number two, what needs to change from a policy or institutional perspective so that we can actually reach, do that leapfrog that YB Liew has just described? Maybe Shahril?
Yeah, I enjoyed listening to that because I think that's exactly the kind of thinking that's required. I'm just going to add to that by saying my generation, we've had our fill of incrementalists. And sort of building on what YB said, I think now is time for big plays. And we're talking about Petronas. In Bumiputra circles, you talk about Tabung Haji, PNB. This was that generation. And I feel like, reflecting on your remarks, YB, the last 20, 30 years, there's not been any, there's been some attempts on major shifts. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to build a new Petronas or always build new institutions. But the big, brave moves have been lacking. And there's a million excuses for this. Oh, last time there was no social media. Last time you had BN winning 2/3. You put anyone also they can win, so there's no worry about the elections. Yeah, okay, fine. There were some structural advantages for making big, bold actions then. But we have to accept that those days are gone. So if that was a precondition of ever doing anything brave, then we might as well forget it. We'll never do anything brave. So what is the example of doing something brave? Then I'm not saying when I'm grumbling here that I have the answer of how you would do it, but I think it's quite clear to answer your actual question, what do we need to do to then make attainable what YB said, right, or approaching it? We need more fiscal space. And he would know this better than most. Most of our operating expenditure is locked in already, right? It's just not discretionary. It's your pensions, it's your civil service salaries, it's your subsidies. And if you're not willing to trim those things, to open up space, to then be able to spend on any number of these things that he mentioned, I'm not saying that it's always going to be about government spending, but knowing how Malaysia works, and any country works, if you're going to seed something, at the start you definitely need public spending to go into the areas that, for example, if you want to make strategic decisions about how you create certain nodes, it becomes very strategic to the entire world and becomes defensive and resilient capabilities in the semiconductor space. You want to encourage certain companies to go horizontal and enter different sectors. Confirm you need money, right? Because there will be certain policy levers that will require that. Not everything is development expenditure, some of it is OE. You also need to then free up other space so that your debt, your fiscal debt can be spent towards things that are productive. So I feel like that is one big bold action which successive administrations have not fully been able to do. This one tried to do it, but you could see even in the subsidy rationalization, there was a lot of hedging involved. Right? You took away, but you also reduced it from 205 to 199 so that you can go to the public and say, I reduced price. Yeah, net you've saved, but you could have saved more, and perhaps more importantly, you jump with both feet into the thing rather than say, yeah, I'm doing this, but at the same time, I did reduce few prices. So you're not giving the right signal, in my opinion. So those are, I would say, that's one big area. Just open up fiscal space, being brave and imaginative in how you convince the public, and maybe trusting that there is a way to win this argument with the public with the help of better communication, thinking of how you would reduce the impact to the lower income households, but making the case that there needs to be pain in this generation. And making sure it's as fair as possible. So that means you need to signal also that your T5s or your T2s, maybe this goes to his point yesterday, have to pay a disproportionately higher, or try and pay more, right? And I know this is a labyrinth of how exactly you would design this. Is it wealth taxation? Is it just the kind of signaling stuff so that the masses understand that we are not taking the brunt of it, all of it, but these rich guys are also doing the same, or in some ways being taken more of. So, that debate needs to happen. You need to win the argument from people on Twitter who say, you shouldn't tax the T5 or the T20 more because they pay most of the taxes. I mean, that's such my opinion, that's such a silly argument. You're always going to pay more lah. But if you believe in progressive taxation and paying back to society that allow you to become rich in the first place or facilitated so what's your ideology, right? If you are of that school of thought, then you should be prepared to pay more. These are all debates that most politicians don't dare to make because it's far easier to just keep everyone happy, but then it becomes a boiling frog syndrome and eventually everyone dies.
Wonderful. And Shakira, you want to share with us your thoughts on how attainable YB Liew's vision is and what would be the main challenge to overcome?
Personally, I remain cautiously optimistic. And I want to build on Shahril's point on policy communication. Because I think this is like third crisis in a decade. And we're still having a discussion on who deserves subsidies. There's still a big misunderstanding on what are subsidies for. Some people think it's incentive, some people think it's reward, some people forget that it's actually a form of assistance. And it surprises me because these are the same conversations that we had a few crises ago, and yet we have not moved the needle so much in terms of the public understanding and acceptance of the policies. So I think not just talking about subsidies per se, but I think there needs to be an improvement in the way policies are communicated. I think we have to move on past that generation where people see policymakers as the group of people who know it all, but it should be more collaborative, more engaging. And it should be a free space where people are allowed to express their opinion, no matter how ridiculous or how crazy it can be at certain times. So I think that's one thing. And I think one more point about, going back to the 1970s and Petronas, and that was also the time where the new economic policy was introduced. I certainly was a beneficiary. My mom, my parents were definitely beneficiary. And I think one lesson, if you want to continue and build resilience going forward, is you always need to go back and revisit those policies. I think that's one of the oversight that we did. So we let certain policies that had a major impact on the society, take for example NEP, and we sort of let it move from one year to the next without having a real conscious intention of saying, all right, this has worked, let's see if it should continue, what has not worked, and how should we go about from here going forward. That should be, I think, a principle if we really want to think about the next leapfrog, the next Petronas or whatever big policy, that has to be built in structurally, formally into its design, rather than just say, okay, maybe after certain years we'll come back and think about this. I think that's one important thing that we should think about going forward. So I leave it there, and I pass this back to Shah.
Yes, please, YB.
Can I contribute a bit to this conversation? What Shahril pointed out is true. Those are the challenges, but I think the following that I would like to describe is also potential way out. Number one, I think we need a bit of a healthy dose of technological nationalism. Okay, I want to be very cautious because every economist is so worried about nationalism, but a bit more priority given to Malaysia in an industrial policy is something that is a way out. I say this because now it is increasingly fashionable to talk about industrial policy compared to just a few years ago. Even IMF now talks about industrial policy. So I'm permitted to say that. But I also feel that we have not actually linked industrial development very much to the capital market that we have. So last week I gathered Securities Commission, Bursa, Bank Negara, EPF, and a few other agencies to look at how to link the semiconductor industry to the capital market in Malaysia. How do we create circularity in terms of capital for our industry? And at some point, I agree with Shahril about his comment much earlier. We have to now renegotiate our relationship with some of the FDI. So when I was in MITI, if companies come to me and say that, oh, Vietnam or Thailand is giving me this tax incentive, can you match? I would openly say this, and I've openly said it. If it is better for you to relocate to Vietnam, let me help you, so that you relocate certain part of the manufacturing processes to Vietnam and keep some of them here. I do not see Vietnam as a competitor. I see Vietnam as a continuation of my supply chain. And that will shift the conversation. So a healthy dose of technological nationalism will help us to change the way we see things. Secondly, the idea of social market can be considered in our context. I started looking at the health insurance issues recently. We have a public sector. You ask MOH say, don't touch it, I want this. We have a very lucrative private healthcare system. Okay, the Sunway just listed and make a lot of money out of it. But I think what is lacking is the middle. What is lacking is a structured social market. That means it's still market mechanism, can be driven by insurance and others, but the state has to come in with society to shape a social market. We may have an opportunity. The MHIT that will be introduced by Bank Negara together with MOH and other agencies will have two tiers of hospitals. Tier 1 are hospitals that are considered more compliance and less costly, and there's a tier 2 which are hospitals that are not following this framework. So I've been recommending to Bank Negara to look at tier 1 and define tier 1 and eventually give it a name, and hopefully the name is social market. That means there is social element, but it's also a market mechanism. Thirdly, I think we need to deal with the question of wages. Wages, productivity, and how we compensate people is something that we have to look at. Our wages are set, Malaysian wages is set in Singapore and Bangladesh. There's 1.1 million Malaysians working in Singapore as a CEO and also garbage collector at all level, and we hire maybe 2 million of Bangladeshi, some documented, some undocumented. So that I think has to change. We have to have a serious conversation about how we compensate people, and therefore with better compensation, then we can reimagine different sort of productivity conversation. We then do not have to see Malaysians working as cheap labor in Singapore, but we will have to deal with the questions of unskilled foreign labor in Malaysia. Then I think we have to rethink our cities. And at some point, I think our city should be designed for and by the Gen Z. Malaysians at a certain age, my generation and those above my generation, think that everyone needs to own a house, everyone needs to own a car. And everyone not only needs to own a house, but everyone needs to own a landed house. I think that has to give way to a different conversation. And I really hope that more Gen Z will come forward and say that we want to design the cities that we want. And we want politicians, we want developers, we want GLC cliques to listen to the Gen Z and design something that they will like, and it will suit climate challenges, it will suit their future life. We really need cities that are not developed by developers, but cities developed by young people for their future, for their decades to come, so that they live a life that they feel belong. Finally, I think it is time for us to revisit the vision since 1970s. 1970s, there was a particular historical context. At that point of time, the conversation was Malay-led, but I think we have come to a stage where we can actually build a Bangsa Malaysia narrative, a Malaysian narrative, and a Malaysia that is standing tall and resilient in a more complicated world. That Malaysian narrative, I think, has come, and we should really capitalize on the opportunity to develop a Malaysian narrative that is shared by most people.
Thank you, YB. Very well articulated the 5 key points. Looking at the time, I think we should give an opportunity for our audience to also interact with the panelists. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. Maybe we'll take 3 questions first. Yeah. So, Liana, you want to start?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Liana. Just a disclaimer, I'm asking as a Malaysian, nothing to do with my affiliation at the moment. Great conversation, really great policy ideas. But I think what we're missing here is the fact that your voters are not rational economic agents. They are going to vote based on what's happening right now, narratives that are being pushed. And the date today, 13th of May, is extremely embedded into what the conversation is all about. How do you manage that? Because in all honesty, we are seeing the world, the global politics shifting to a right, very nationalist, but very worrying nationalism mindset while we're going through this kind of global economic challenge. Something to ponder.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, then we'll give it to the panelists. The gentleman in red.
Hi, good morning to the panelists. My name is Marcus. I'm from the Global Institute for Tomorrow. I just want to provide a bit of context before I ask the question itself. Now, we are familiar with the phrase that winter is coming, and Malaysia has faced many winters in various kinds in the past. So we deal with too many variations of shocks and existential threats, and as what Shahril mentioned earlier, and also YB, you touched on this, it happens too frequently these days compared to many times in the past, and it's because of many factors as well. So maybe what I really want to understand is the thinking process, because I believe what we actually have is a thinking problem. Singapore has a doomsday plan. Malaysia, within its distance and as a neighbor, we do not have a doomsday plan. So the idea is basically understanding the thinking process that is required for us to have solutions that make Malaysia more durable. And essentially, today we succumb to this idea of global influences labeled as FDI. And we are happy to basically take them in and forever be entrenched, because you see the influence is not reducing, it is in fact being amplified, and it's growing into many different sectors. So if we want to continue this conversation about sovereignty, about self-dependence, about being able to have the circularity that you mentioned, YB. And to be honest, today, finances, as mentioned earlier as well, our debt globally is still very much dependent on these powers as well. So how do we come up with a doomsday plan that makes Malaysia dependent very little on global powers, decoupling from them? And how do we continue to be sufficient for ourselves?
Thank you. So we'll take a third question.
Hello. Hi. I'm Asla from the Malaysia National News Agency, Bernama. I just wanted to ask, mention a bit. I was intrigued when Ms. Shakira mentioned earlier that, one of the major social challenges in Malaysia is facing an aging population, and I believe which could contribute to economic pressures in the coming years. So my question is, let me give some context before I ask my question. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government allowed large withdrawals from EPF savings, which may significantly affect the retirement security of many Malaysians' future. So in addition, I think financial literacy among Malaysians remains relatively low, and our younger generations today who are increasingly exposed to debt through easy access personal loans and credit facilities, or from all these banks and financial services providers. So given these concerns, how do you think, I think it's open to all the panelists and especially YB Liew, given these concerns, how do you think the government can better address the issues of retirement preparedness and rising household debt while also improving financial literacy to ensure stronger economic resilience for our future generations?
Okay, thank you. So we have three questions. The first, looking at the sort of the toxic or very highly polarized ethnic politics, that color our landscape. The second is about, do we have a doomsday plan? Yeah? And the third is about, a very important point about the aging population and how does resilience mean in this context. Kan? So maybe we can start with YB Liew. Would you like to?
The unasked questions is whether voters are rational. Now, from a campaigner point of view, I have never regarded voters as rational. Except that over the years in our campaign, especially those campaigns that I was involved in each campaigns, emotions are around love, hate, fear, and hope. Okay? Most elections are not about being rational. Most elections is about framing love or hate, fear or hope. I would say that in most of the campaign that I was involved in, we have always put emphasis on hope. We have been putting emphasis on hope and on a better future. So these were actually the driving force of our campaigns over the years. And the public responds to it and respond positively to it. I think when we become government and when we run government, the challenge is that we have not been able to articulate a holistic vision on the basis of hope yet. That I think in part because Malaysia is moving from an old political order that has crumbled into something new that we are not used to. We are still not used to thinking that there's no more dominant parties. There are parties who still think about dominance, but there is no more dominance. But how to create mechanism that will create what they call space for negotiation and legitimize negotiation. Now negotiation and coexistence is often seen as a problem. So I mean these are the challenges that we have to deal with. With the end of a one-party state, there's also something that has changed fundamentally. The federal-state relationship has changed fundamentally. Because during the one-party state, the UMNO president was the prime minister, and most of the state chief minister were appointed chief of the liaison committee of UMNO, and they were beholden to the UMNO president who was prime minister. That has fundamentally shifted. Yet we have not created a healthy conversation around it. But we will have to change that. So anyway, just to answer your questions, I do not think voters are acting in rational manner, but emotions in election doesn't have to be just about hatred. Emotion in election can also be about the longing for a better future and hope. On the questions of self-sufficiency, I do not advocate self-sufficiency. In my articulation of resilience, I think we are still part of the world and we want to be the indispensable middle in the world, especially in supply chain. But the more security we have within Malaysia and within ASEAN, the better it is for us. Now, we have not touched much about ASEAN, but my hope is that in the years to come, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia will be able to conceive and create a more resilient ASEAN that is building around more activism in order so that we can build a stronger ASEAN. I have opened my big mouth to talk about the needs for more contributions and even financial contributions from the countries that are richer in ASEAN, Singapore included, and also for countries like Malaysia and Indonesia who believe in an ASEAN vision. We will need to put our best people in ASEAN. We need to be prepared to contribute more financial resources in order to build a much stronger ASEAN. So I'm not advocating self-sufficiency for the sake of self-sufficiency, but more circularity is definitely good for resilience. The third point about future, especially for retirees, for an aging society, we will have to deal with our health system. Whether we have to take the route of a national insurance like Shahril suggested, or we can somehow imagine that we have a public sector, we have a private sector, we have a middle social market sector, and we come in to create a more harmonious coexistence of the healthcare system, including perhaps decanting more patients to the social sector from public sector, and maybe work closer to private. I mean, all this I think is worth debating. So healthcare is one question. Second question is really, I think we need to create a strong middle class. We need to make our people richer. When they are richer, they will have more retirement saving. And that I think has to happen. Finally, it is also about the ownership of our companies and technology. You cannot deny that if your companies own some technology, there will be technological rent. And when you have technological rent, you are able to do more, both R&D as well as you have a class of people who own technology. It's a different conversation for our societies.
Shahril, would you like to?
Yeah, try and make this brief so that we can maybe potentially have other rounds. On the first question, was it Liana, right? On politics and whether voters vote rationally or not. I think it's a brave politician to say on public that voters are not rational.
I never campaign on rationality.
Yes, so I'm actually helping YB here. So any of the press, please don't do the headline. While Liew Tong says voters are not rational. I'm helping you out. Your press officer needs to cover also with the press here. But of course, we take your point, and I think it's well made. I think two things and two slightly different points worth pondering. One is we meaning the establishment or people of some means, and I consider myself one, need to be quite self-aware as to why there is an appeal by the populace and usually populist right. Because you can complain, grumble, saying they are wrong and mistaken, and I do think that, but I also am quite reticent to say that, we are faultless, we are blameless in this. There's been enough years where it's plausible to say that the elite or whatever passes off as the elite have not acted fair. And this is not just politicians or ex-politicians, this is anyone with means, and most people in this room, I would dare to suggest. If you come from an urban space, if you're English speaking, I think we all in some way bears some responsibility for this. When we always, whether it's in our consumption habits, whether it's in the unbridled selling in the 90s and 2000s about globalization being great, and communicating it in a way that the man on the street or the woman on the street can't really relate to, and they were shoved down their throats that this idea of globalization is going to lift all boats. And I think this is a story not just of Malaysia but of the world, right? If you look at the West, that shift to the right, it's explained in part by this. Even if you think Brexit was a silly idea, but there was something there. What was driving that? So it begins with that self-awareness. And with that self-awareness, then perhaps we need to put our best foot forward. We, meaning the ones who believe in global cooperation, believe in progressive ideals and all the rest of it. And I'm taking for granted that most of the people in the room believe in that. Then with that self-awareness, figure out how do we then communicate in more like Mamdani and less like Starmer, if I can be quite blunt. In fact, I don't even know if I'll consider Starmer progressive. Yeah, that's true. Wrong example. But you know what I mean, right? So I think less of this grey suit technocratic type, but more of someone who's able to capture the zeitgeist, channel it in a way that is not about hate, but is about hope, it's about... And then I then ask myself, right, are we then, unfortunately, do we need somebody who looks right? And that means a working class, lower middle class person to sell this. And that's not me. Even though I actually come from a working class background, but I've been grateful. I'm grateful that I've done fairly well in life. But you know what I mean. You need somebody from that background to sell this message. Because without naming names, if you think of who are the most right-leaning politicians in this country, what do they tap into? They tap into the anti-elite sentiment. These are elite, I'm grassroots, and they sell this, right, to kingdom come. And I sometimes get bored to death because I know who they actually are. But some are more convincing than others about selling this idea that I'm kind of grassrooty or salt of the earth type. Maybe we need somebody from that kind of background to sell a different message, and we're waiting for that. So I think more of that is probably what's needed, Liana, to counter that, because we need a different language that is not this dry technocratic language to win this argument against the populist right. Very briefly on the other points, because I want Shakira to say more. I think on Marcus's question, mostly agree with YB. I don't think self-sufficiency is the way we do this. It's resilience, which is holistically defined, and that means I think 4 or 5 times both of us have said the same thing. This idea of leveraging, you say, indispensable middle of the supply chain, however you term it, is that. But being very intentional about where are the nodes that we can deliberately build to build resilience from that. And whether we've stumbled upon it, whether it became organic, we built organically, semiconductors clearly one of those nodes, but I think that needs to be expanded. And are there different parts of of our economic story that can be built into nodes? I think grudgingly you have to also acknowledge that Singapore, who have done this, I think, quite intentional over the decades, right? And they have, to use Marcus's point, this idea of a doomsday plan. They were never admitted, but they I think, in my mind, they operate as a society with a view of the world that's very press here, right? So that is there's a siege mentality, which I think is a positive siege mentality in their minds. That they always have. If you look at how Vivian speaks, their foreign minister, what does he always say? The world is replete with examples of small states who have died. So he keeps saying that. I'm like, why do you keep saying this? Then I realize, right, they need this for their internal messaging. Is it a political play so that certain parties win? Maybe, but I think part of it is really what they believe in. The entire government needs to believe that if Singapore doesn't get everything right, they will be destroyed. Whereas we have this resource curse, right? We've got palm oil, we've got oil, so worst case, still okay. And that's a boiling frog situation that we have. So I think it's this resilience holistically defined, where we have very intention moves to build nodes of indispensability is maybe another way to say it. And I'll let Shakira speak about the last question around pensions and around aging society.
Can I interject just for one moment? No, Mamdani was a son of a professor. So Shahril still qualified to be the forefront.
Right, thanks. Okay, so I'll be very quick on Diana's question. Actually, it sort of come across my mind when we talk about irrational or, voters. Actually, policymakers are not really rational either. We are in this mess currently because one very, very irrational person somewhere in Washington keeps on changing his mind from one day to the next. So that's just my contribution to your question. So but on that note, I think one thing that we can take away from this is that we have to remind ourselves that there are nuances in what progress means for the people of this country. For some, I think, the urban voters is probably, progress is probably seeing a lot of technology being put to use, seeing a lot of interactions being very liberal in your outlook. But if you ask other fellow Malaysians, their idea of progress and development is different. It could be more spiritual, it could be more emotional, and you have to acknowledge and respect that. And there is no easy way to sort of marry those things together, but to have a very universal and prescriptive outlook on things is certainly not the way to go either. That's how I feel on the first question. Now, on your second question from Marcus, on what's the winning formula. Now, I want to go back to your reference point on Game of Thrones, right? So I enjoyed the season up until season 5, before it turned for the worse. But there is no unique formula. But one lesson that we could learn, so there's always the White Walkers that is about to enter, and winter is coming definitely. And the reason why Westeros sort of fall into shambles because there was warring between the various houses, the Lannisters, the Targaryens, the Starks. And I think that's the lesson that applies to us. Winter is coming, but if we continue with a very small infighting, with discussing very, very minor issues, on who gets to sit on the Iron Throne and whatnot, we will not be ready for what is coming from the north, right? And so on your third point, Asla, on elderly, I think it goes back to Sharil's earlier point about fiscal space. Now, going back to the situation in COVID where we had to resort to withdrawal of EPF, part of the reason why we had to take that route was because we didn't have enough buffers to allow for a bigger social spending on the vulnerable groups. Therefore, we had no choice but to resort to retirement or savings. And I think that's one, again, repeated lessons that we have not addressed from the 3-4 crises that we have experienced so far. And I think wages is definitely another thing when you talk about retirement. You talk about financial literacy, but I don't think anybody can plan for financial literacy savings if you don't have anything to plan on in the very first place. And then finally, I think when we talk about aging population and the elderly, I don't think we can ignore about care responsibility and care work for the society. Everybody plays a role, the government, society, the private sector, and I think we should keep that in mind as well. All right, so thank you, Shah.
Thank you, Shakira. So we're going to take 2 last questions. Okay, one there and one here. Okay, please. That one first. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. So actually, I initially came to this forum with the thought of adding the heat to the spark that YB brought up yesterday. But after listening to the forum, right, I was very interested because personally, I've never been in a session with YB, and this session has changed my mind as someone who's not been from an economic background. So going to my question, right, I was very interested when both YB and the other panelists mentioned on shifting our mindsets towards resilience. And let's go a bit to the history, right? Let's talk about Pak Lah, our beloved 5th Prime Minister. Looking beyond his policies in Islam Hadari policies, his economic policy at his time, if you were to critically assess his approach on economic policies,
we can summarize it in a very short sentence as a man far too ahead of his time, where he actually the policies that he wanted to introduce are already being discussed here in this session. You know, he talked about pushing investments to the national and agricultural sector to increase food security, and also he also even tried to work to reduce the petroleum subsidies, but was met with heavy street, I believe, protest. Back it was in 2006. I was 1 year old. I don't remember this. However, because of these policies being too ahead of its times, you know, the citizens were, you know, perhaps not really bought into his vision. It caused sort of an early short, as we know, downfall to his administration. And this reflects to the moves that the current government is actually trying to make. You know, we're trying to prioritize long-term approach. So maybe my questions towards all the panelists: how do you balance this approach between trying to lead this voters to buying this idea of pushing for the long-term goals, you know, the long-term benefits of, and going choosing the unpopular routes, you know, the unpopular decisions, while trying to maintain the voters' happiness, I would say. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Daniel? Yeah.
Okay, easy questions, guys. Just easy questions. I'd like to start with Shakira. From a social welfare design perspective globally, where is Malaysia in this hierarchy across education, health, and maybe caring for the aging? Because you've spoken about this, but are we really starting from zero, or are we like somewhere else? I think that's a question. Second, for YB, you know, we talk about Global South. We've not mentioned Hormuz very much today, though that all of that's happening. I think looking at Global South, you know, we've got European ambassadors here. We talk a little bit about China, Central Asia, Africa, etc. Where do you see ASEAN or the Global South's next key partnerships coming from in order to build this resilience? And the last one to Shahril, Zeitgeist, you know, there's this guy who we all know, KJ, looks good, respected globally, has a great podcast. He also navigated us out of COVID-19 during as health minister. So do you see him returning to politics and having that sort of global, regional presence, guiding Malaysia as we have discussed today? I'll leave this to you how you want to take it. Thank you.
Okay. One last question.
One last question from me. Okay. Imran from Citizens International, and in CR we are quite big on encouraging conversation about South-South collaborations in a way, and I think so far, I think it's important for us to look at the domestic politics as at all. But I think one thing that I wanted to highlight and ask the panelists is about the international architecture. Because again, one of the main problems facing the Global South is that we are somewhat stifled by the international architecture, trades and everything else. I mean, the WTA meetings happening in Cameroon a few months ago, there are proposals of nonsense, in fact, that, you know, some countries are allowed to play not by the rules, as you see in many cases. So the question is this, I mean, as the Global South and South-South collaborations, what can one do, and what Malaysia has done, in fact, to sort of engage and try to reform this unjust, somewhat one-sided international architecture that are always there since the beginning of time, that often stifles the developments of Global South stories. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have 3 questions. The first one is about long-term goals and the short-term trade-offs. And then we have the South-South cooperation by Imran, and then we have some very targeted questions by Daniel. So again, we'll go with the YB Liew first, followed by Shahril and Shakira.
Quick reply to your first questions. I think as far as petrol is concerned, this government did not choose to take abrupt decision, but Budi 95 is a tool for gradual shift in subsidies. I suspect it has a lot to do with very long political memory of the Prime Minister of perhaps June 2008, fall of June 2008, Pakla increased petrol prices by about 70% overnight. Sorry, by 40% overnight, fall of June 2008. And that has somehow cost him politically very dearly. But I suspect also it has a lot to do with the memory of 1998. Suharto fell on 21st of May 1998. But on why there was this abrupt, downfall of Suharto, of course it was building up since the Asian financial crisis from July 1997. But it has also has a lot to do with Suharto increasing petrol price due to the pressure of IMF in early May. So within 2 weeks, or 2.5 weeks, he was gone. And that has he increased petrol price by 70%. And that has a lot to do with the downfall of Suharto. And I suspect PM Anwar decided to take a gradual approach towards subsidy reform, in part because of these long memories. To answer Daniel's question as well as the other questions, I'm not very sure how far this label of global south can help us to understand the world moving into the future, because I'm not sure how to place China, how to place Russia in these discussions of the global south. So I would prefer to see Malaysia and ASEAN as a middle power. And in order for all of us to move into the future without seeing the situation where we know that the US-dominated unipolar world has ended, but we do not want to see a sudden shift of power center from Washington, D.C. to Beijing. I think that is not what we want. We do not want to see the shifting of US power straight into Chinese dominance and Chinese hegemony. I don't think that is something. We do want an end to one hegemony and replaced by another singular hegemon. And I also do not think that we would like to see a G2 world where China and US sit down and decides on everything without us being part of it. A G3 world with the US, China, and Russia is also not something good for us. So I would like to see that in the years to come, Malaysia and many other middle powers, including European countries, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, I think it's in our interest to see a very strong middle ground. And with that strong middle ground, we have space and we can work with partners of equal size or relatively equal size. That world will be much better if the middle is stronger and the middle can command a certain voice and make certain decisions that even the G2 has to follow. It may be an idealistic situation, but I guess it's something worthy of our effort.
Wonderful. So it's like a global village dominated by the middle class.
Yeah, I think not much to add to IB's point from the first question around how do you balance. I think that is a perennial question. I previewed some of my thoughts in my earlier answer around making sure your communications meet the moment, maybe the way you recognize and not talk down on people. I think to Shakira's sort of hint is also what's necessary, but no easy answer. Maybe Pala is actually a good example of somebody who comes across not as a bangsawan, right? Even though his background might be quite, but maybe we need one more of those, one more iteration of that kind of set of leaders. But I want to jump straight to Daniel's point, because I think I'm at the risk of slightly contradicting myself. I have come to the view that we shouldn't wait for saviors. And I don't know if I have this smaller podcast called Subtext, and that was my last episode.
But we want to wait for Shahril.
You want to wait for Shahril? Yeah. Yes, definitely. Thank you, I'd be too kind. But I think that's part of our problem as a society, that we've been yearning for a hero, and it tends to be a male hero. And that feeds in, the reason I mentioned this gender thing is also feeds into the macho self conception of many politicians. I don't think it's an accident that you have disproportionately more alpha type people who enter politics, because it appeals to a certain kind of trait. And I say this with self-awareness. I'm sure, even though I like to think I'm a bit more metro, but I'm sure there's a bit of that in me especially when I was in a game, right? Who doesn't like the praise? Who doesn't like the idea of telling people what to do or coming across as smarter than the other? That's all of that ego piece, right? Is in every one politician. And probably you need a bit of that to want to do this. Otherwise, there's other better ways to help people. But maybe the issue is when you yearn so much for one savior, you don't look at the systemic issues that are probably worthy of attention. What is the culture of our debate? What is the education system like? How do we ensure that political parties are not so top-heavy in terms of power? How do we talk? So it becomes like, instead of institutionalizing reform, it is about what has that prime minister done? Or what is this future prime minister going to do? When really the solve here is this generation of politicians who does something so that anybody who takes over a set of institutions that are far more amenable to our values and aspirations, right? So, but before you think I'm copping out and not answering your question, do I have hope to that individual that you mentioned? Of course I do, right? I've known him for so many years, and he has his fans and his detractors, but I like to think I'll be a critical friend. I used to work for the guy in my 20s, but I no longer. And that's a different dynamic now. And I think I'm in a privileged position in the sense that I know him probably better than most. I want him to see him succeed, but I also will tell him the truth maybe behind closed doors about what I think needs to happen for him to fulfill his immense potential. And I think he is one of the few politicians who can communicate well, has real decisiveness, which I think was best demonstrated in the COVID pandemic, able to learn quickly, become a jack of all trades, right? He will maybe not be an expert in healthcare, but he was able to learn quickly, and then rather than say on the one hand this, on the other hand that, this is my decision, and follow through. I think that's an important trait in policy making and in a politician. And more broadly, and I'll say this publicly, I think he is at his best when he's true to his own values. And he has a set of values, and I hope he's true to those, and I will want to support him towards that mission, right? Last one around this global majority or global south question, also agree with Wabila. I think it's probably a situation where we want to grasp onto this, right? Because we see almost an opportunity with the end of one hegemony, and you're figuring out, how can we be more proactive or more impactful in the world rather than just be a passenger. So I think that first order thinking is correct, that principle is correct. But what is perhaps most important is looking at our backyard first. So ASEAN is probably the most underutilized or under potential collective that we could do that approximates this idea of working together. And if we don't solve that, then it's hard to then talk about how can we make alliances or think about shared values with a country halfway around the world. I'm not saying it's impossible, but surely it should be easier to start doing it in our neighborhood. And that requires different kind of imagination about this ASEAN way, and whether the original ASEAN countries are willing to re-look at how we build this ASEAN consensus in a way that can be less paralyzing, which is my criticism of the organization.
Right, I'm conscious of the time. It's already past noon, but I'll jump straight into Daniel's question on social spending. I think I will break it into several pieces. So we have education, we have health, and we have social spending as well. And I think the challenges with each component is slightly different from one to the other. On education, I think relatively we spend quite a fair bit on education, I think around 4%. So it's a decent amount. The challenge there is, how do we spend it? Where do we spend it? And I think there's a lot of improvement that can be done. We spend a lot on certain things that may not be as urgent, but I think I think my view on this is that we spend very little on the early years of education. partly it's because we always link education to the job market. And so we tend to focus a lot, in the university on how graduates sort of move into into their careers. When I think fundamentally it already starts from the very beginning, from preschool, for example, from primary education. And that's where I think that we tend to think it's not as important as preparing people to the next part of their life. On health, I think there's a lot of discussion already. I think YB and Shahril is already privy to this. We spend very little on health, at 2% of GDP. And I think if we compare ourselves to other countries, same level of development, they double of what we spend. And the core issue of that is we still go back to fiscal. There's not enough fiscal space for us to expand, for us to move and be flexible and think about how to improve. And there's a lot more challenges coming. We are entering into an aging population, as we talk about. So the challenges of the health system is going to change into more, for example, facilities that are needed for non-communicable disease, for geriatric purposes. That has not been talked about. And we need money, unfortunately, for that purpose. And I think on social spending, we spend even very little. So I think less than 1% of our expenditure, government expenditure, goes into social spending. It's very inadequate and it's very fragmented. And it cannot move the needle when actually, if we really want to be redistributive, that's where I think a lot of the energy should be spent into. And I think the bigger challenge when it comes to social spending, it's twofold. The first is, I think, the impact of spending on social sector is long-term. So unlike, for example, medium-term policies on FDI, an investment in education will only yield the results 10, 20 years down the road. And for a very rapid-moving society like us, you tend to get that, accountability question. Where is the result? Where is the result? And I think a good communication strategy is needed. And finally, my second point on what are the challenges to social spending is I think we need a shift in ideology. A lot of the thinking is very grounded on a very meritocratic way of thinking. It's what's in it for me, what's in it for this, what's in it, how do I maximize the return from my tax dollars for myself, first and foremost, before I think about the rest of the other citizens. That needs to change. It's not an easy task. It requires a lot of change in terms of how we view things, in terms of prepping the society from the very beginning. But I think those are the two big challenges when it comes to social spending. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pass this back to Shah.
Thank you, Shakira. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, all good meals do come to an end. And so I think we've had a wonderful time with our panelists here. They have really articulated some very interesting ideas, and I hope that you are leaving this event with a greater clarity, about the issues, but also from the tone of the discussion, with a greater hope, about our future. Now with that, I'd like to invite you to give a big applause to our panelists. And I also like to invite you to give a big applause to the organizers, Asli and Sunway University, for organizing this wonderful event. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our panelists.